Hi, I'm Garrett from Crust, and I'm going to talk a little bit about and show you how I assemble the SUN XCD Exceed Crankset. The Exceed Crank is a classically styled double with a 50.4 BCD, based off the early Stronglight 49 and Specialities TA crankset. The Exceed Crank is made in Taiwan using cold forged 6066 series aluminum and comes in four sizes: 165 millimeters, 167.5 millimeters, 170 millimeters, and 172.5 millimeters. Altogether, both arms with the bolts and the caps and the chain rings and all the hardware holding the chain rings on, this crankset weighs in right around 554 grams, which makes it one of the lightest aluminum doubles that you could put on your bike. When you order the Exceed Crank from Crust, this is what you'll get. Inside of this box is the drive side crank arm with the 50.4 BCD flange on it, as well as the non-drive side crank arm. Behind each cap are the bolts to attach these to a square taper bottom bracket. Underneath this piece of cardboard inside of the crank box, you'll find two sets of bolts. One is to attach the larger chain ring to the 50.4 BCD flange on the drive side crank arm. The other is to attach the smaller chain ring to the larger chain ring. There's also a set of pedal washers in there. If you're ordering the crank from Crust, you'll get a 28 tooth small ring and a 44 tooth large ring. So now you've got all these parts, but you still have to assemble your crank. Well, don't worry, it's not too daunting. It's a fairly simple task to throw the rings on the drive side arm. You just need a few simple tools. First, you're going to need two 4mm Allen wrenches. You need two because the bolts that hold the small ring onto the large ring are 4mm Allen keyed on both sides. Next up, you need a 9mm combo wrench like this one, or maybe a socket wrench with a 9mm socket. And finally, I suggest you get some blue Loctite. This is for the bolts that hold the larger ring onto the drive side flange. The bolts that hold the smaller chain ring onto the larger ring already have a little bit of Loctite on them, but you could throw it on there as well. This isn't necessary, but it's highly, highly, highly recommended. Okay, let's get started installing the chain rings to the drive side crank arm. I like to start with the big ring. To install the big ring, you need the bolt set that came in your crank box that has 5 bolts included in them. I'm using Loctite on these bolts. I've put Loctite on 4 of them, made a little mess of that one, but you really don't need that much. Sometimes Loctite can be hard to deal with, but you just need a small dab, just like that, and that's it. Once you got all your bolts Loctited, then you just need your one 4mm Allen wrench and your 9mm wrench. First, you want to slide the crank arm through the back of the chain ring like that. And you should line the bolt holes right up, and this pin will line up with the crank arm. Then you can start installing all your bolts. I like to start with the ones next to the crank arm because they can be a little fiddly, so it's easy when you can move the chain ring around. So I just like to put those two in, and then to hold them in place, I just loosely put a nut on the back. Now you'll see on these nuts they have a little flange on one side. The flange goes towards the flange on the crank, so it kind of centers everything up. Okay, and now you can just throw the nuts and bolts in whatever order you want. You don't need to tighten them down, you can leave them loose just to hold them in place for the time being. Okay, now that you have all your nuts and bolts on, you can start tightening them up. What I like to do is take the 9mm and just hold the nuts in place on the back, and then take the 4mm and tighten them down nice and snug. And as you're tightening them down, now see I started here, and I want to work in a star pattern as to tighten the chainring down nice and evenly. So I'll go from here to this one, to this one, to this one, to that one.
You just go opposite of whatever bolt you're working on. That way, the ring gets tightened down nice and even. It's a little bit of a juggling act, but you can do it. You can do it.
Okay, and that's it. All right, now we'll move on to the smaller ring. For the smaller ring, you're going to use your other pack of bolts that are just the 3 with these nicely machined heads on them that sink very nicely down into the chainring and fit flush. These 3 thinner washers are included with them. I don't ever use those. I think they're for installing the chainring forward facing, but the way these nuts and bolts are machined, it's nicer to install it reverse facing. You can do whatever you want, but I like doing it this way. So to do this, I like to flip the crank arm over and then take the flanged washers and push one of those through. And then you take one of the thick washers, put that on, and then, as I said, the smaller chainring will be facing in reverse as to countersink the bolt very nicely into it, so it's nice and flush. And again, you want to just leave that just threaded on, not even tight, because you're going to have to move the chainring quite a bit to do this little act of installing the other bolts and washers, or I guess spacers, or what they really are. And as you can see, these bolts are already Loctited, so that's what I was saying. You only really need it for installing the large ring, but I guess you could put more on here. I don't really think you need to, but I don't know. I guess it wouldn't hurt. Okay. So I got all those threaded on, ready to go. So you just take your 2 4mm, and you stick, again, I just put one on the back, and it's kind of a balancing act, but you just tighten down, and you want to make sure they're nice and snug. Oh yeah, that looks nice. There you go. Your chain rings are installed and your crank is ready to be installed onto your bike. If you use Loctite, I would maybe give it a little time to set up. You don't want to put this on your bike and start riding too soon with the Loctite not fully set up. It might back the nuts off and essentially render the Loctite ineffective. If you have any questions or comments about the SUN XCD Exceed Crank, you can leave them in the comments below or give us a call at 804-442-3710. Thanks for watching.